Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I have with me Mr. Michael Kugelman on my new English channel, The New Word. I hope you will subscribe the channel. And thank you very much, Michael Kugelman, who works in the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and he has a very keen eye and he has a very deep understanding of South Asian politics, particularly India and Pakistan. Thank you very much, Michael, for your time for our channel.
Thanks. Good to be here and congrats for the new channel.
Thank you. Michael, my first question to you is, and I want this discussion to revolve around this question, is that most recently India's Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, gave a statement in one of the conclave. I think he was talking with the media. He said that much of the India's problem with the U.S. are because of Pakistan. What do you think that what are India-U.S. problems because of Pakistan, and why India is not happy with the US? How do you read that statement? What kind of connotation or understanding is of yours on this statement?
Yeah, it's an interesting statement. I mean, because I would argue that there are other issues in the U.S.-India relationship that constitute more of a tension point than the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, and that could range from India's longstanding relations with Russia to long-running tensions over trade issues between the U.S. and India. But I think he hit on a key point in the sense that the U.S.-India relationship is in a pretty good place, but at the end of the day, both countries have a pretty significant relationship with the other's top rival. And certainly, the Pakistan factor has indeed been a constraint for U.S.-India relations. I would argue much more so in the past. So I think that it's a much more powerful argument from a historical perspective, in the sense that during the Cold War era, the U.S. and Pakistan were allies. They had a fairly close partnership, and that's one reason why India was not formally allied with the Soviets, but it certainly was close to the Soviets. It had a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. And then also right after the 9/11 attacks, more recently, when the U.S. formed a new counterterrorism alliance with Pakistan, that was very problematic and concerning for India. So in other words, whenever there's been a moment in history when there's been particularly strong levels of military cooperation between the US and Pakistan, because India clearly and understandably has worried about the flow of weaponry from the US to Pakistan, particularly because, as we later learned, Pakistan has indeed used some of the weaponry that it received from the US. It's used it against India. Pervez Musharraf admitted that some years ago. But I think looking at things now, I don't think Jai Shankar's argument is as strong, in the sense that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship continues to be there. It's in a fairly good place, and I think there's reason to think that we could see some new areas of cooperation around things like healthcare and energy and climate change. But I think the trajectory of U.S.-Pakistan security and military relations is not very strong, and I think that should be reassuring to India. So I think the bigger issue is India's relationship with Russia. Again, it's something that the U.S. and India are able to get around, but I think the Russia factor is a much bigger factor in the U.S.-India relationship than the Pakistan factor is.
Well, Michael, what you are referring to, it seems, is that that is an American perspective that how India-US relations are different. But from India's perspective, is that India has been saying that either it is the arms which are coming from the United States and that giving some of the support. And I think what he's referring to is that maybe when India was talking to the international community and to the US that about the situation in Kashmir. At first place, the Americans kept supporting Pakistan even at the UN. Then later on, when the non-state actors involved in Kashmir. So is he's talking from that perspective that Americans remain silent on that? Do you think that this is one of the angle what India is thinking? That and the American silence on that is a logic. The Indians are not happy with the US.
Well, it's funny. both the Indian and the Pakistani sides often suggest that the U.S. is taking the wrong position on Kashmir. I mean, of course, in Pakistan, there's always been unhappiness that the U.S. has not been willing to focus on the issue more prominently. So I don't know. I don't think that the U.S. has really not taken a position on the Kashmir issue, and by not taking a position, that really moves it closer to the Indian position. And of course, India doesn't want the world to be weighing in on Kashmir because it believes it's a settled issue or at most a bilateral issue to be worked out with Pakistan, hypothetically. So I don't think that if Jaishankar was referring to what the U.S. thinks about Kashmir and a perception that the U.S. is taking a position that's close to Pakistan, that would be very inaccurate. And I think also getting back to the issue of military assistance, the Trump administration cut off all security aid to Pakistan early in its term, and the Biden administration has not undid that decision. It has not resumed security aid to Pakistan. So again, that's something that would be received very favorably in India. So I just don't think he has a really strong argument at this point in time for this notion that the U.S. policy toward Pakistan is somehow problematic for India. I just don't think it stands on very strong legs at this point.
Hmm. Well, Michael, okay, what you believe that there is no strong point in that, but there is one thing which we have I have felt personally, and I have spoken to many people. It seems that the word is getting the word fears from India, because for instance, I've noticed personally that uh, the world doesn't want to support Pakistan, for instance, on Kashmir and many other issues, because they believe that India will be annoyed because their dependency is on India, or India's economy is getting bigger, so we need to support, for instance, India in Indo-Pacific, or the great powers believe that India is helping them, or India will engage them in the future course of history in Indo-Pacific. Do you think, and with this, you may have seen that India is asserting itself, the way Jay Shankar spoke in Washington about the Russian oil, and particularly when he spoke in Europe, that the Europe needs to change its mind about South Asia and India. So how do you see that the understanding, or how do you see that the thoughts which are coming from India's foreign office and the government?
Right. I mean, well, I think that this has been a constant with the current Indian government, that it doesn't like when other countries, including its close partners, weigh in on and criticize Indian domestic policy. And we've seen, and this is not something it only does with countries it doesn't get along with, like Pakistan. The U.S. has been criticized by the Indian government whenever it releases a new report on the plight of religious minorities in India. Secretary Blinken's recent comments, making a very matter-of-fact boilerplate statement that the plight of religious minorities is troubling or problematic or whatever he had said in India. These types of comments are not appreciated in India. And my own view, to be quite frank, is yes. I mean, the U.S. is hypocritical in the sense that it calls out countries for human rights violations and things like that, when the U.S. itself has had issues with human rights, and also so there's that. But India, it claims that it wants to become a major power. Now, whether it can reach that status remains unclear at this point. But if you want to move toward a position where you're seen as a major power, I think you have to be willing to accept commentary and criticism from the outside, including on your domestic issues. To constantly respond angrily and defensively, it's not going to help. And especially if we look at this of what's played out in recent weeks, when you had those, the unfortunate case of several ruling party leaders in India making comments against the Prophet Muhammad, and you actually had countries outside of India reacting angrily. And I think in that case, India recognized that, it does have to realize that there's going to be a time when countries are going to respond not very favorably to things playing out in India. But at the same time, and I'll end here, India does recognize that it has a certain level of leeway in terms of what it does and what it can get away with, in the sense that it gets a free pass from many countries in the West, but beyond. India, as you had suggested before, I mean, it's widely viewed as an important market, as an important economic player. It's got one of the top economies in the world. And many countries in the West see it as a key strategic bet to help counter China. And that means that there's going to be limits to how far the West would go in criticizing India. So in that sense, India may be overreacting and that it doesn't get as much criticism as it could otherwise. China gets a free pass too, quite frankly, for very different reasons, right? I mean, the fact that you have this terrible situation playing out with the Uyghur Muslim community, but the Muslim world is pretty silent on that, just like it's pretty quiet about the plight of the Kashmiris. This is realpolitik, right? It's realpolitik. That's what it is. International relations is driven by considerations of interest, not morality. So anyway, that's my long answer to your good question about how I think India's tendency to be very critical of others when it disagrees with what they have to say about what's going on in India. I guess I could understand, but it doesn't seem to make much sense given what India is trying to do in terms of projecting itself as a growing power.
Hmm. Well, Michael, moving forward, I have another question, and that is, how do you see this India's stance on Ukraine? Although much have been said on that, but most recently there was a report that the crude oil import from Russia to India has increased by 18% just from February this year till June. So, do you think that the Indian justification of being neutral with the West on Ukraine has been taken or has been well received, or do you think that it has raised the eyebrows in West and particularly in US?
Yeah, I think initially India's position was a big problem for officials in Washington. And here I should emphasize an important point about domestic politics and society in the U.S. I would argue that the Cold War has never really ended in the sense that there has continued to be a lot of hostility toward Russia within Washington and within America on the whole. And I think it's become a partisan issue too, in the sense that the Democratic Party thinks the Russians, prevented Hillary Clinton from winning the election in 2016. But, I've always sensed that just a lot of unhappiness about Russia and Russian policy that's been in place since the end of the Cold War. I mean, during the 90s, yes, you had a détente when you had Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin trying to work together. But since Putin took over, there's just been a lot of unhappiness toward Russia. And so when Russia invades Ukraine, I think that for many policymakers in Washington, they just were utterly infuriated that a close partner like India would be unwilling to call out Russia for the horrible thing that it did. And again, because this was Russia, a country that's viewed with considerable hostility here in Washington, I think that Russia's position was particularly difficult to accept. Now, for those in Washington that understand the history and understand the history of India's relationship with Russia, they would understand. But it's just it's the Russia factor is a considerable one here. And I'll say this, that I live in a neighborhood that's not particularly known for being political. It's not in Washington D.C. It's outside of it. But when I go outside and walk around in the neighborhood, it seems like every other house is flying a Ukrainian flag. These are people that would know nothing about foreign affairs, may never even have heard of Ukraine until this invasion. But because of their unhappiness about Russia and their unhappiness about Russia on the whole, they're showing that type of support. So I do think that the U.S. position and the Western position toward India's position on the Russia invasion has changed. I think that there's a recognition now that it's not possible to get India to change its position. India's view is that it's neutral. Calling out Putin, calling him names would do nothing to change the situation on the ground. It wouldn't get things closer to the invasion, to the war ending. And so I think that what the U.S. wants to do now is to try to make an argument to India that it's time to play a long game, and that it's time for India to stop thinking about Russia as a trustworthy long-term partner. And so I think U.S. officials are going to make the argument that as Russia, as it faces the impacts of sanctions and becomes increasingly cash-strapped, it won't be in a position, it won't have the resources to produce the type of weaponry that India has long depended on, and that the U.S. will increasingly be seen as a player that can step in and sort of fill in that role that Russia had played. And we've seen even in recent years the share of U.S. arms imports, pardon me, the share of Indian arms imports from the US has actually risen. Even though Russia continues to be India's top arms partner, India's been importing more and more US arms in more recent years. So clearly the intent is there. But at the end of, in the near term, I think the U.S. does recognize that India is not going to just turn itself away from Russia. It's going to be more of a long-term process. And in terms of the oil imports, that's different because India doesn't depend on Russian oil or energy as much as it does Russian arms. And so I think that U.S. officials here are more not sympathetic, but willing to accept India's argument that it's dealing from the external shocks to its economy from the pandemic and other things, and that it needs cheap oil, and that if Russia can provide some of that, it's going to go for it.
Yes. So, Michael, moving forward, I have another question, and that is that uh, a few years back there used to be a trend where Pakistanis used to ask Americans that you are giving a preferential treatment to Indians, for instance, in the civil nuclear deal that started during President Bush's time. But over the period of time that you have seen that the entire balance has shifted in the favor of India. So where do you think Pakistan is left with the choice when Pakistan used to be a Western partner? Pakistan used to be a partner of the US and many Western parts, but now it seems that in the establishment or the concerned quarters in Pakistan believe that we are left with the no choice but to side with the China. So how do you see this trend in Pakistan US relation and Pakistan's relations with India vis-a-vis US?
Yeah, well, it is ironic that the U.S. And Pakistan are allies, and the U.S. and India are not allies, and yet there's much more forward movement on U.S.-India security relations than U.S.-Pakistan security relations, and India gets a lot more arms from the U.S. than Pakistan does these days. Well, it's getting no arms from Pakistan these days. Sorry, that Pakistan is getting no arms from the U.S. these days. So yeah, I mean, it's clear that we started to see, I would argue, probably with the signing of the civil nuclear deal, a major shift in how the U.S. looked at its relations with India and Pakistan. The U.S. was willing to overlook, India not being an NPT signatory, and it was able to overcome domestic opposition to pursuing a nuclear deal with India, despite its status as a non-NPT country. And clearly, that was something that was very troubling for Pakistan. And after that, we've just seen a major shift. We've seen all these new agreements between the U.S. and India, these so-called defense foundational agreements that will allow the U.S. and Indian militaries to work much more closely together through communication and tech transfers and information sharing. There hasn't been any of that with Pakistan. I can't think of any new notable security agreement between the U.S. and Pakistan for quite some years since the immediate 9/11 era when they signed that new alliance. So I think that Pakistan it accepts, or it'll have to accept, that the train has left the station, so to speak, and that there's no turning back with the U.S.-India relationship. Has been some discussion within the analytical community in Washington about how much it could realistically expect from India as a strategic partner, given its friendship with Russia and given some of the domestic things playing out there. But no one is saying that the U.S. and India should scale back their security relationship in a big way. So, and in terms of the China factor, it's interesting that my own view is that the U.S. wants to have a relationship with Pakistan, even as it continues to grow out its relationship with India. My sense is that Pakistan wants to have a relationship with the U.S., even as it grows out its relationship with China. And I don't agree with this notion. I think you've heard this from your former prime minister, Imran Khan, that Pakistan has been pressured. It's being pressured by the U.S. to move away from China and align itself with the U.S. I don't think that's true. I don't think there's. I really think that the U.S. it accepts that Pakistan has a close relationship with China, and that does impose limits on growth in U.S.-Pakistan relations. But I think the U.S. also views that there's plenty that you can do even within those constraints, and that entails cooperation, safe spaces like climate change and healthcare. There was a new U.S.-Pakistan health dialogue that was just announced by our ambassador in Pakistan a few weeks ago. So things could happen, and so I think that the whole great power rivalry thing is sometimes overstated in the context of U.S. Pakistan relations.
Okay. So, Michael, my last question to you is that how do you see that India is being included in this I2U2, where the next a multilateral platform, before that it was Quad. So, what do you think the Americans are feeling a need to have India in the Middle East, even where they're having Israel, UAE, United States, and India? So, what do you think? There's a mindset in Washington that India should be part of United States and the other Middle Eastern countries, and having that platform.
Yeah, so the first thing here is I think they need to change the name, right? I2U2 sounds like a Star Wars character or something. West Asian Quad would be better. Anyway, yeah, I think that this new arrangement is very much a product of the Abraham Accords. I think that's the main reason why it came about, right? When the UAE signed a peace deal with Israel, that all of a sudden sort of allowed these four countries to all say that they got along very well because India's relationship with Israel had been growing in recent years. Of course, the U.S. and Israel have long had a strong partnership. The U.S. India had growing out their partnership. The U.S. and the UAE are very strong. So that was the final piece of the puzzle to get Israel and the UAE in a position where they could be close partners. And I think that if you look at why it's come together, first of all, I wouldn't overstate the potential for this quad. There's no single unifying purpose. There's no single unifying factor, as there is with the Pacific Quad, where countering China is the big focus. But half of these countries, Israel and the UAE, they want to deepen their relations with China, certainly in the commercial front. So that's one factor right there. I think that it comes down to very basic issues, technology. I think that that Israel and India are seen as countries that can provide technologies, tech, agricultural technologies are a big deal as well, particularly for water management. I think that India has its eye on both Israeli and UAE water sharing technologies that have been used very effectively in agriculture in those countries. I think the U.S. may hope that this new quad can give it a new platform to try to wean Israel and the UAE off of their economic dependence on China, though I'm not sure that'll work. Um, but I think that's pretty much what it comes down to. It's four countries that get along well, wanting to take advantage of that. I think that the U.S. also sees an opportunity to add a new dimension of its relationship to India, where it could work with India in another mini lateral arrangement, so to speak, outside of the Indo-Pacific. And India, I think, has its own reasons, wants to have a seat at the global high table in many contexts, so it would welcome this type of arrangement. And I think similar with the Israelis and the UAE, they're looking for ways to project their power and their clout with like-minded countries. But I don't think we should overstate the future of this arrangement. It is a big deal and an encouraging sign that there will be the first leaders meeting of this new quad in the coming weeks. But beyond that, let's see where it really goes. I'm not that optimistic about its long-term prospects.
Mm. Well, anyhow, thank you very much, Michael Kugelman, for helping us to understand this developing and growing India-US relations, and obviously the statement which came from the Indian Foreign Minister, and the apprehension and the concerns which India shares with the US. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.